April 19, 1945. Dawn. The transport ship Isle de France cuts through the gray Atlantic swells 3 miles off the coast of Halifax, Nova Scotia. The wind carries salt and diesel smoke. Below deck, in a converted cargo hold where light filters through riveted seams, 217 German women sit in silence. Their wrists are bound in steel manacles, connected by chains that rattle with every sway of the vessel. They were the tattered remnants of Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms, some still bear an eagle and swastika, now faded and torn. Their faces are hollow. Hunger has carved shadows beneath their eyes. They have not bathed in 11 days. The air smells of sweat, rust, and fear. One woman, Margaret Hoffman, 23 years old, former signals operator from Würzburg, stares at the chains around her wrists. She does not cry. She has no tears left. She remembers what the British guards told her at the processing camp in Southampton. "You're being sent to the Canadians. God help you." She remembers the rumors whispered in the holding pens. Stories of Soviet camps where women were stripped, beaten, starved. Stories of French villagers who dragged collaborators through the streets by their hair. She knows what happens to women on the losing side of history. The ship's engines groan. The chains rattle. And Margaret Hoffman prepares herself to die. She does not know that in less than 2 hours, a young Canadian corporal named Thomas Leclerc will unlock her chains and offer her a cup of coffee. She does not know that he will look her in the eye and say, "You're not animals." She does not know that this moment will shatter every belief she has held about the enemies of the Reich, about the meaning of strength, about the machinery of war and the fragility of propaganda. She does not know that 43 years later, she will return to Halifax with her granddaughter and stand on the pier where she first stepped onto Canadian soil, and she will weep, not from grief, but from a gratitude so vast it will feel like drowning. But that is later. For now, she sits in chains and the ship moves toward land. By the spring of 1945, the collapse of Nazi Germany is not a possibility. It is a certainty. The Red Army has encircled Berlin. American and British forces have crossed the Rhine. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, is a broken fleet of grounded metal and dead boys. In the chaos of retreat, the Allies have begun to capture not just soldiers, but the vast apparatus of the Nazi war machine: clerks, engineers, radio operators, nurses, cooks. Among them are thousands of women who served in auxiliary roles, the Kriegsschafferinnen, the war helpers. They manned anti-aircraft batteries, decoded signals, repaired aircraft, staff communications networks. They wore uniforms. They took oaths. And now, in the eyes of international law, they are prisoners of war. But what do you do with female prisoners of war when the world has no precedent for them? In Soviet-occupied zones, German women are marched eastward into forced labor camps. In France, collaborators and prisoners alike are subjected to public humiliation, their heads shaved, their bodies beaten. In Britain, overcrowded camps strain under the weight of hundreds of thousands of POWs. And so the decision is made: Canada, vast and distant, will take them. The Dominion has space, resources, and, crucially, distance from the rage that consumes the European continent. Between 1943 and 1946, Canada will house over 35,000 German prisoners of war. Among them, in the final months of the war, are the women. The women do not know what awaits them. They have been told nothing. They have been fed propaganda for 12 years. Stories of the undermentioned, the subhuman enemies of the Reich, the barbaric Soviets and decadent democracies. They have been taught that Germany's enemies are cruel, degenerate, envious of German strength. They have been told that surrender means annihilation. And now, as the ship approaches Halifax, they believe it. Margaret Hoffman is not alone in her fear. In the hold, women whisper prayers. Some clutch photographs of children, husbands, parents, images they expect never to see again. A few have attempted suicide during the transport. British guards have found makeshift nooses fashioned from torn clothing. The women are chained not because the Allies are cruel, but because the Allies are afraid. Afraid the women will harm themselves. Afraid they will riot. Afraid they do not know how to process the sheer foreignness of female combatants. The chains are regulation. The chains are protocol. The chains are the only language the war has taught anyone to speak. But the chains are about to come off. The Isle de France docks at Pier 21 in Halifax at 9:17 hours. The sky is overcast, the color of wet concrete. A cold wind blows off the harbor. On the pier, a detachment of Canadian soldiers waits. Members of the Veterans Guard Canada, older men deemed too old for frontline combat, tasked now with the mundane but necessary work of prisoner management. They have been briefed. They know the women are arriving. They've been told to expect hardened Nazi loyalists, fanatics, women who would spit in their faces and sing the Horst Wessel-Lied as they are led to the camps. But when the cargo hold doors open and the women begin file out onto the deck, the soldiers see something else. They see girls. Thin, trembling, filthy girls. Some are barefoot. Some have frostbite on their fingers. Their chains clank against the metal gangway as they descend. They do not sing. They do not shout. They stare at the ground, and they shuffle forward like ghosts. Corporal Thomas Leclerc, 29 years old, a farmer from rural Quebec, stands at the base of the gangway. He has been in uniform for 4 years. He has never seen combat. He has spent the war guarding supply depots and processing prisoners. He is a quiet man, a man who believes in fairness and routine and the simple dignity of work. He does not hate Germans. He does not hate anyone. He reads the briefing papers and he follows orders. But now, watching the women descend, he feels something shift in his chest, a kind of sorrow he does not have words for. The first woman reaches the bottom of the gangway. She is perhaps 19, her hair matted, her eyes red from crying. Her chains are too tight. The skin on her wrists is raw. Leclerc looks at her. He looks at the chains, and he makes a decision. He steps forward. He takes a key from his belt, a standard-issue handcuff key. He reaches for her wrists. The woman flinches. She pulls back, eyes wide with terror. She thinks he is going to strike her. She thinks this is the beginning of something worse. Leclerc stops. He raises his hands slowly, palms open. He speaks in broken, careful English, though he does not know if she understands. It's okay. I'm going to take these off. He reaches again, gently this time. He unlocks the first manacle. It falls away. The woman stares at her wrist, uncomprehending. He unlocks the second. The chains drop to the ground with metallic clatter. Leclerc looks at her. He says quietly, "You're not animals." The woman does not move. She does not understand the words, but she understands the tone. She understands the look in his eyes. And for the first time in 11 days, she breathes. Behind her, the other women watch. They see the chains fall. They see the Canadian soldier step back, unarmed, unafraid. They see him gesture toward the pier, toward the transport trucks waiting to take them inland. And one by one, as they descend the gangway, the Canadian soldiers remove their chains. Not because they are ordered to. The regulations say the prisoners should remain restrained during transport. But the soldiers look at the women, at their torn uniforms, their bleeding wrists, their faces etched with exhaustion, and they make a choice. They choose mercy over regulation. They choose humanity over protocol. They unlock the chains and they let them fall. Margaret Hoffman, when her turn comes, does not speak. She holds out her wrists. The soldier, a man whose name she will never learn, unlocks the manacles and drops them into a bucket with the others. He hands her a canteen of water. She drinks. The water is cold, clean. She has not tasted clean water in weeks. She drinks until her stomach aches, and when she lowers the canteen, she sees the soldier smiling, a sad, tired smile that somehow makes her want to weep. She does not weep. Not yet. She climbs into the transport truck, and the convoy moves north into the interior of Nova Scotia toward the camps. The camps are not what the women expect. They expect barbed wire and guard towers, starvation rations, and forced labor. They expect cruelty. They expect the machinery of retribution to grind them into dust. What they find instead are wooden barracks heated by coal stoves, rows of clean cots with wool blankets, mess halls where Canadian cooks serve hot stew and bread. They find latrines with soap and running water. They find a camp infirmary staffed by a doctor who treats their frostbite and malnutrition without malice or judgment. They find guards who are not cruel, who do not strike them, who call them by their names instead of numbers. The dissonance is unbearable. Margaret Hoffman, assigned to Camp 23 near Fredericton, New Brunswick, spends the first 3 nights staring at the ceiling of her barack, unable to sleep. The mattress is too soft. The silence is too loud. She keeps waiting for the cruelty to begin, for the mask to slip, for the Canadians to reveal themselves as the barbarians she has been taught they are. But the cruelty never comes. Instead, there is breakfast, porridge with milk and sugar, coffee with real cream. There are work assignments, but they are light. Mending uniforms, tending gardens, sorting supplies. There are Red Cross parcels with chocolate and cigarettes. There are radios in the common rooms, playing music. American jazz, British swing, songs that were forbidden in the Reich. The women do not know what to do with kindness. Kindness is not part of the script. Kindness is not something they have been trained to process. Some of them reject it outright. They refuse to eat. They refuse to work. They insist the Canadians are trying to poison them, to humiliate them, to break their spirits with false generosity. A handful of hardliners among the prisoners form a secret cell, singing Nazi songs in the barracks at night, enforcing loyalty through intimidation. But their numbers dwindle, because every day the evidence mounts. The food is real. The medicine is real. The decency is real. And slowly, haltingly, the women begin to accept it. In the camp archives, preserved in the Library and Archives Canada, there are letters. Hundreds of letters written by German POWs to their families, subject to censorship but otherwise unaltered. The women write about the food. They write about it obsessively, almost compulsively, as if trying to convince themselves it is real. We had meat today, real meat and potatoes with butter. They gave us apples. I have not seen an apple in 2 years. The bread is white and soft. I ate 3 slices and they did not stop me. Food becomes a language through which the women begin to understand their captors. Because in Nazi Germany, food has been rationed since 1939. By 1945, civilians in Berlin are surviving on 1,000 calories a day. Soldiers at the front are eating sawdust bread and nettle soup. The women in the camps have spent years hungry, watching their bodies shrink, their strength fade. And now, in captivity, they are fed, not lavishly. The Geneva Convention mandates that POWs receive the same rations as the captured nation soldiers. The Canadians follow the letter of the law, but to the women, it feels like abundance. It feels like wealth beyond measure, and it does not make sense. Why would the enemy feed them? Why would the victors share their resources with the defeated? Margaret Hoffman asks this question aloud one evening in the mess hall. She is sitting with 3 other women, all former Luftwaffe auxiliaries. They are eating beef stew, thick with carrots and potatoes. A Canadian guard, a middle-aged man named Corporal Davies, overhears her. He does not speak German, but one of the women translates. Davies pauses. He thinks for a moment. Then he says through the translator, "Because you're human beings, and human beings need to eat." It is not a profound answer. It is almost banal in its simplicity. But to Margaret Hoffman, it is a grenade thrown into the architecture of her understanding. Because in the Reich, humanity is conditional. It is earned through blood, through loyalty, through racial purity. It is something the strong possess and the weak forfeit. But here, in this camp in the Canadian wilderness, humanity is assumed. It is the baseline. It is not something you earn. It is something you are. She does not know what to do with this information. So she eats her stew and she says nothing. The transformation does not happen all at once. It happens in small moments, in gestures so minor they almost escape notice. It happens when a Canadian nurse in the infirmary holds a hand of a woman dying of pneumonia, staying with her through the night, so she does not die alone. It happens when a guard helps a prisoner carry firewood to her barack, not because he is ordered to, but because the woman's back is injured and he sees her struggling. It happens when the camp commander, Major Harold Thompson, institutes a policy allowing the women to send and receive letters from their families in Germany, even though the war is not yet officially over, even though the regulations are murky, even though it would be easier to deny them. It happens when the women are allowed to celebrate Christmas in 1945, and the Canadians bring them a tree and decorations and a chaplain who conducts a service in German. Some of the women weep during the hymns. Not because they're devout, but because they did not expect to live long enough to see another Christmas. It happens when Margaret Hoffman, working in a camp garden one afternoon in June, is approached by a Canadian officer who asks if she knows how to repair radios. She does. She spent 2 years as a signals operator. The officer asks if she would be willing to repair a radio in the camp office. She agrees. She spends 3 hours rewiring a vacuum tube receiver. When she finishes, the officer thanks her and gives her a pack of cigarettes. Real cigarettes. American Camels. She does not smoke, but she takes them anyway, because the act of being thanked, the simple, courteous acknowledgement of her skill, feels stranger and more valuable than gold. And it happens, above all, in the slow, aching realization that the Canadians are not pretending. This is not a trick. This is not a temporary kindness designed to extract intelligence or cooperation. This is simply how they treat prisoners. This is their system. This is their ideology made manifest. The women begin to ask questions. They ask why Canadian soldiers are allowed to refuse orders if they believe those orders are immoral. They ask why the camp has a library with books in German, including books banned by the Reich. They ask why the Canadian government allows newspapers to criticize the government, why workers are allowed to strike, why citizens are allowed to vote. They ask these questions shyly, haltingly, through translators and broken English, and the Canadians answer, not with propaganda, not with speeches, but with facts. Yes, soldiers can refuse illegal orders. That is the law. Yes, you can read whatever you want. That is freedom of thought. Yes, people criticize the government. That is democracy. To the women, these answers are incomprehensible. They have been taught that democracy is weakness, that freedom is chaos, that strength comes from unity and obedience. But here, in the camps, they see something different. They see a system that trusts its citizens, that disperses power instead of concentrating it, that tolerates dissent instead of crushing it. And that system, somehow, has won the war. This is the ideological earthquake. This is the moment when the foundation cracks. Because if the democracies were weak, how did they defeat the Reich? If freedom is chaos, why are the Canadians so orderly, so efficient, so calm? If abundance is a lie, why is there so much food? The women do not have answers, but they begin slowly to doubt. There are records, photographs, documents, testimony that capture the texture of this transformation. In the archives of the Canadian War Museum, there's a photograph dated August 1945. It shows a group of German women prisoners standing outside a barrack in Camp 33, Ontario. They are smiling. Not forced smiles, not propaganda smiles, but real, hesitant smiles, the kind people wear when they're surprised by joy. One woman is holding a kitten. Another is laughing. Behind them, a Canadian guard leans against a barrack wall, smoking a cigarette, relaxed and unarmed. The photograph is unremarkable. It is not dramatic. It is not cinematic, but it is evidence. Evidence that something happened here. Something that does not fit neatly into narratives of war and vengeance and retribution. Something quieter. Something human. In 1947, 2 years after the war's end, the repatriation of German POWs begins. The women are processed, interviewed, cleared for return to Germany. Many do not want to go. They have spent 2 years in Canada, fed and housed and treated with a decency they never expected. They are returning to Germany that no longer exists, a shattered landscape of rubble and hunger and Soviet occupation. Some of them beg to stay. Under international law, they cannot. They are repatriated. Margaret Hoffman is among them. She is placed on a transport ship in Halifax, the same pier where she arrived, the same cold Atlantic wind. She stands on the deck and looks back at the city, at the green hills, at the country that imprisoned her and, in doing so, freed her. She does not know if she will ever return. She returns. 43 years later, in 1988, Margaret Hoffman, now Margaret Fisher, widow, mother 3, grandmother 5, board the plane in Frankfurt and flies to Canada. She has saved for this trip for years. She brings her eldest granddaughter, Clara, a university student studying history. They land in Halifax. They take a taxi to Pier 21. And Margaret stands on the same spot where, In April 1945, a young Canadian corporal unlocked her chains and told her she was not an animal. Clara does not understand why her grandmother is crying. Margaret has never spoken about the war, not in detail. She has never told her family about the camps, about the hunger, about the chains. But now, standing on the pier, she tells Clara everything. She tells her about the fear. She tells her about the propaganda, the lies, the machinery of hatred that turned ordinary people into collaborators in atrocity. She tells her about the ship, the chains, the certainty that she would die. And she tells her about the moment the chains came off. The moment a stranger looked at her and saw a human being. The moment the world cracked open and revealed a truth she had been taught to deny. That mercy is not weakness. That kindness is not naivete. That a system built on human dignity is not fragile, but strong. Strong enough to defeat fascism. Strong enough to defeat its enemies. Strong enough to prove that another way is possible. Clara listens. She does not interrupt. And when her grandmother finishes, she asks, "Do you think he remembers the soldier who took off your chains?" Margaret shakes her head. "I don't think so. He probably did it for 100 women that day. It was nothing to him, just his job. But it was everything to you." Margaret nods. It was everything. Corporal Thomas Leclerc never knew the impact of his actions. He died in 1979 in Quebec, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He spent his post-war years farming, raising cattle, attending church on Sundays. He rarely spoke about the war. When asked, he would shrug and say it was not very interesting. He had never seen combat, never done anything heroic. He had only guarded prisoners, processed paperwork, followed orders. He did not think of himself as remarkable. But in the spring of 1945, on a cold pier in Halifax, Thomas Leclerc did something that shattered the worldview of 217 women. He removed their chains. He offered them water. He looked them in the eye and acknowledged their humanity. And in doing so, he became an argument against fascism, against cruelty, against the idea that strength and brutality are synonymous. He became proof that a democracy, a free society, can be stronger than tyranny, not in spite of its compassion, but because of it. This is the paradox the women confronted. This is the truth that haunted them. They had been taught that the Reich was the pinnacle of civilization, that its enemies were decadent and weak. They had been told that hardness, discipline, and ruthlessness were the virtues that would forge a 1,000-year empire. And yet, when the empire fell, it was not the strong who survived. It was the kind, the patient, the ones who believed that even enemies deserved dignity, the ones who unlocked the chains. The women carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them rejected it, retreating into bitterness and denial, but most of them did not. Most of them allowed it to change them. They returned to Germany and rebuilt. They raised children and taught them a different story, a story not of supremacy and vengeance, but of humility and grace. They told their grandchildren about the Canadians who fed them, who treated them with decency, who proved that another world was possible. And in this way, the moment on the pier became a seed that took root in the soil of post-war Germany, a seed that grew into the Federal Republic, into the Wirtschaftswunder, into the project of European unity and reconciliation. It did not grow alone. It was one seed among millions. But it grew, and it mattered. There is a memorial in Halifax now, at Pier 21, commemorating the millions of immigrants who entered Canada through that port. It does not mention the German women. It does not need to. The pier itself is the memorial. The stones remember. The water remembers. And somewhere in the archives, preserved in faded letters and brittle photographs, the women's voices remain. Testimony to the strange, unglamorous miracle of mercy. This is not a story about heroes. Thomas Leclerc was not a hero. He was a farmer in a uniform, a man who followed his conscience when the regulations failed him. The women were not heroes either. They were collaborators, complicit in a regime that murdered millions. They wore the uniform of the enemy. They served the machinery of genocide. However, indirectly, they do not deserve admiration, but they received mercy. And in receiving mercy, they learned what it meant. They learned that humanity is not conditional, not something earned or forfeited, but something inherent and inalienable. They learned that a society strong enough to defeat fascism is also strong enough to forgive, to rebuild, to insist that even the guilty are human. This is the lesson of the chains. Not that the women were innocent, not that their suffering absolved them, but that mercy, extended even to the undeserving, is not weakness. It is the ultimate assertion of strength. It is a refusal to let the enemy dictate the terms of your soul. It is the insistence that you will remain human, even when your enemy has abandoned humanity. The chains fell because men like Thomas Leclerc believed this. They believed it quietly, without speeches or fanfare. They believed it in their bones, in the tired muscles of their hands as they turned the keys. They believed it when they looked at the women and saw not monsters, not abstractions, but girls, hungry, frightened, defeated girls who had been lied to and used and discarded by their own government. And in that moment of recognition, in that simple act of unlocking a pair of handcuffs, they proved something that the Reich, with all its tanks and planes and fanaticism, could never understand, that the greatest weapon is not violence, but grace. That the truest strength is not in chains, but in the courage to remove them. Margaret Hoffman died in 2003 in Stuttgart at the age of 81. She was buried beside her husband in a quiet churchyard. At her funeral, her granddaughter Clara read from a letter Margaret had written years before, a letter never sent, addressed to no one in particular. It said, "I do not know the name of the soldier who took off my chains. I wish I did. I wish I could tell him what it meant. I wish I could tell him that in that moment, everything I believed shattered. I had been taught that the world was hard, that strength came from cruelty, that mercy was a lie weak people told themselves. And then a stranger unlocked my chains and handed me water, and I realized I had been lied to, not just by my government, by myself. I had chosen to believe the lies because they made me feel strong, because they gave me purpose, because they absolved me of the terror of being free. And when the chains came off, I had to face that terror. I had to face the truth, that I was responsible, that I had chosen, that I could have chosen differently. I do not deserve forgiveness. I am not asking for it. But I was shown mercy, and that mercy taught me what I could not learn any other way. It taught me that the world does not have to be hard. That cruelty is a choice, not a necessity. That freedom is not chaos, but the terrible, beautiful responsibility to choose rightly. I did not choose rightly, but I was given a second chance. And I have tried every day since to be worthy of that chance. Not because I earned it, but because someone believed I could be. Clara folded the letter and placed it in her grandmother's coffin. And as the coffin was lowered into ground, she thought about the chains and the pier and the young soldier whose name no one remembered. She thought about how history is made not just by great men in grand battles, but by small, unremarkable moments of decency that ripple outward, invisible, shaping lives in ways no one can measure. She thought about the chains and the hands that remove them, and she understood, finally, what her grandmother had been trying to say, that mercy is not forgetting. Mercy is not excusing. Mercy is the refusal to become what you hate. Mercy is the insistence that even in the darkest hours, when every instinct screams for vengeance, you will choose something better. You will choose to see the human being standing before you, wrists bound, eyes hollow, terrified and broken, and you will unlock the chains, because they are not animals, and neither are you. Epilogue. The chains are gone now, melted down, recycled, forgotten. The women are gone too, most of them, their voices fading into the static of history. The camps are empty, overgrown with weeds, repurposed or demolished. Pier 21 is a museum. The Isle de France was scrapped in 1959. Thomas Leclerc's farm in Quebec is owned by strangers. The world has moved on, but the moment remains, preserved in archives and fading letters, in the testimony of women who could not forget, in the quiet conscience of men who did their duty and asked for nothing in return. The moment remains as a reminder, as a challenge, as a question posed every generation. What will you do when you hold the key? Will you tighten the chains, or will you let them fall? Will you choose the easy cruelty of retribution, or the hard grace of mercy? Will you see the enemy as an animal, or as a human being who was lied to, who chose wrong, who is standing before you now, defeated and afraid, Waiting to learn what kind of victor you will be? The chains are a test. They are always a test. And the answer, written in the hands of a Quebecois farmer, in the tears of a German grandmother, in the quiet dignity of a nation that chose mercy over vengeance. The answer is simple and it is eternal. You're not animals. And that makes all the difference.